I'm here in Washington State for the all-new 2023 Honda HR-V launch. I spent some time with the product planner, Quincy, to walk me through what Honda was attempting to accomplish with this all-new HR-V. This vehicle was designed and engineered in Japan, but for us Americans, and it was a car that they tried to bring up market. The prior generation HR-V was sort of that cheap and cheerful, entry-level budget basement car. This HR-V now is going to be a more expensive vehicle and is supposed to feel like a more premium aspirational purchase. This is no longer going to be the very first Honda someone buys. This, in some ways, is going to be the car that they use to replace their Honda Civic when they're looking for something a little bit more practical and usable, particularly when they have a small or young family. From an engineering perspective, this platform is kind of a Frankenstein of existing products. So while they have changed some components to be all new for the HR-V, the rear subframe and all-wheel drive system is lifted off the prior generation CR-V. The front subframe, which is aluminum, is from the current generation Civic. The rear suspension is from the current generation Civic. And the steering rack, which is also from the current generation Civic, has been retuned. While many of the components are unique for HR-V, it is an interesting hodgepodge of parts. And with the body structure, with many of the improvements they've both made it a stronger body structure, so in case of an accident, you should be safer. And more importantly, they've refined a lot of the NVH out of the cabin. So this is more in line with the prior generation CR-V in quietness. Again, they're trying to make this car feel more premium and less like a penalty box to drive. The 2-liter in this car is naturally aspirated and is paired to a CVT with some internal changes from the prior generation. It does not return class-leading fuel economy, but it is fairly refined and it should be pretty reliable. And when compared to the prior generation HR-V, it produces more power. Now let's talk about the interior and exterior, because that's really why you're going to buy a vehicle like this. The exterior is quite polarizing according to the comments I've read. I've heard everything from this looks like Quasimodo and a Civic hatchback had relations and this is the offspring or byproduct of that, and to the fact that this looks like a Ford Escape. And again, I spoke to Quincy about this and I asked him what were some of the styling cues. Well, they wanted this to look a little bit more sporty and upmarket, so it definitely had some European influences. The other big question I got was about the interior. Some of the comments online were upset that the HR-V no longer has Honda's magic seat. So in the rear, in the past, you could fold and contort them to your heart's content. That is no longer the case for this vehicle, and there's a reason for that. Honda asked current HR-V owners if they use the magic seat, and the vast majority of them did not. And in fact, the magic seat compromised the rear seat comfort of the vehicle. So they prioritized in this vehicle, this generation HR-V, rear occupant comfort. So when you're back there, regardless of trim level, it doesn't feel like you're being tortured for one of your misdeeds. I sat back there briefly and it's not bad. Honestly, I wouldn't have a problem sitting back there for a long period of time. The seats in this car can either be had as cloth or leather, and in either configuration, they are reasonably comfortable. Really, the driving position is remarkably reminiscent of the Civic, and they've gone a long way improving the seat structure itself. And just like in the Civic, which again this car shares some components with, the dash is nice and low and sunken in. It has the same honeycomb design for the HVAC vents as the Civic, and because of the lower dash, you have really good frontward visibility. This car feels very airy, and when you have the moonroof and you have everything open, it never feels claustrophobic. And just like in the Civic and many of the newer Honda products, all of the touch points for the switchgear on the steering wheel, the HVAC controls, and the infotainment feel very high quality. They do a good job, and Honda's traditionally done this, with their switchgear and touch points, making the car feel more premium than it really is. The gauge cluster is a mix of digital and traditional gauges, and just like in the Civic, it works very, very well. The one big change from the Civic is the center console area. It's a little bit more open. You can put things underneath the shifter in this vehicle, and it lends to this overall feeling of utility that does not necessarily exist in the regular Civic. But with that said, I think it's time for us to take this thing for a quick drive. Setting off in the Honda HR-V, we're in sport, traction controls off, and we are in normal mode. God damn. Oh yeah, naturally aspirated, CVT, uphill. That's some real precision crafted performance, or whatever the marketing term is for Honda. So let's talk about the motor first. It's a 2-liter. It's been improved, as I talked about earlier, when compared to the prior generation HRV, and it's paired to a CVT, which has been retuned from the Civic to better deal with the all-wheel drive and the suspension calibration of this vehicle. It's not bad. It is clearly not fast, and when you are near redline, it is definitely that rattly 4-cylinder that you may or may not be accustomed to, but for the most part, when you are driving it more civilized and you're on the highway, it kind of disappears into the background. The calibration's pretty decent. It knows when to downshift when you put it in a sport mode. That rubber bandy feel doesn't exist most of the time. It only comes into play when you are punishing this vehicle. And to be honest, this is an HRV. You are probably not going to be trying to annihilate a twisty mountain road like I am right now most of the time, or at least I imagine you're probably not going to attempt that. Your goal is probably not going to be trying to annihilate every back road of this vehicle. You are looking for something comfortable, quiet, smooth, and refined. And in that regards, that's what this vehicle does really, really well. When you drive this thing, most of the time, it just feels like a bigger, taller Civic hatchback with long travel suspension. As I mentioned earlier, a lot of this is basically a Frankenstein vehicle of existing Honda parts. Yes, they've made calibration changes to make it an HRV, but the steering feels very, very similar to what's in the Civic. The rear end with the all-wheel drive system does a good job pulling you out of corners, where a Civic, if it were wet out, or if you were in snow, or if you were doing some limit handling stuff, tends to plow out in the front just because the front end has no traction. This vehicle, with its on-demand all-wheel drive, does a goodish job, I think, trying to alleviate some of the inherent deficiencies with a front drive car. The ride quality of this vehicle is a massive improvement over the regular HRV or the HRV of yesteryear. It does a good job minimalizing your head bounce. It absorbs bigger bumps, and you can definitely feel that this car has longer travel suspension than the traditional sedan. I guess the question that many of you are going to probably be asking is, how does this stack up compared to its competitors? Things like the Renegade, the Trax, the EcoSport, the Toyota Corolla Cross, and the Mazda CX-30. Well, the American counterparts are trash. I would not buy one of those cars, so I'm going to scrap those off the list right away. Compared to the CX-30, that car is a torsion beam rear end. I think that car does a great job with the suspension architecture it has, but when you compare that vehicle to this HRV, particularly in the rear, this car seems to ride better for the rear occupants. It seems to deal with undulations in the pavement better than the CX-30, and for the most part, I think this car overall is a better package than the CX-30, whether it be the interior, whether it be the way this car rides. Really, its only downside compared to the CX-30 and compared to really some of its competitors is the CVT. This has the same rattly 4-cylinder issues that the Toyota Corolla Cross has. When you compare this to the Corolla Cross, this is a far more refined vehicle. Honda's attempted to make this thing go up market. They've succeeded. This car feels like a CRV from a couple generations ago in overall refinement. It no longer feels like a penalty box. The prior generation HRV felt like a cheap car. This does a better job feeling like a more substantial vehicle. But with that, I think it's time for us to head into the final thoughts and wrap this video up. Final thoughts on the 2023 Honda HRV. While this class of small, entry-level CUV is not the most exciting thing in the world, it is, however, becoming increasingly more important. So, how does this compete against its various competitors? Well, compared to the Americans like the Jeep Renegade and Chevy Trax and Ford EcoSport, those things are absolute turds, so I would not buy one of those vehicles. Compared to the Honda CRV or HRV of yesteryear, Compared to the HRV of yesteryear, this is far more refined and a better vehicle overall. Compared to the Toyota Corolla Cross, that vehicle will probably live forever, but lacks some of the interior refinement of this vehicle. The HRV definitely benefits from being highly based on things like the current generation CRV and Civic. And when compared to the CX-30, that's really its biggest competitor in my mind. The CX-30 has a more refined drivetrain. It is not burdened with the CVT that the HR-V has. However, the interior space and really overall usability of the cabin is not as good as this HR-V, and the rear suspension means the HR-V rides better and definitely handles better at the limit. So with that said, thanks for watching and hope to see you soon.